Truth is a matter of circumstance. It's not all things to all people, all the time. Neither am I.
I've said many times, I'm not exclusively into vintage or modern toys. I'm simply into toys that don't suck. What's frustrating is when I get attached to a modern property where I'm interested enough in it to buy into the toys, and they are just good enough that I can't turn away, but they're just frustrating enough it becomes a slog to get everything just right for my collection or display. A few years back, I talked about my Captain America and Black Widow journey through Hasbro's Marvel Legends line, and all of the kit bashing it required across multiple figures to try and get those toys as close as possible to their film counterparts. At the time I made that video, my main priority was getting Cap and Natasha as they looked in the Winter Soldier. In the few years since that video, while the Winter Soldier remains, in my estimation, the best Marvel film ever made, I've really warmed up to Avengers Age of Ultron in a way I would not have anticipated a few years ago. When Hasbro announced they were finally releasing a Quicksilver from that film as part of their Infinity Saga range, I found myself seeking out the Marvel Legends MCU Avengers roster all over again in their closest Age of Ultron variants. And it was then that I found myself having to do the most work, yet again, on Black Widow to get her looking her best. Looking up from that result, I realized I had unwittingly acquired most of the Scarlett Johansson Marvel Legends figures in the doing. Now, before you rightfully point out that characters like Hawkeye and Scarlet Witch have never had decent Age of Ultron figures made for the range, and that Vision's figure needs a total overhaul by Hasbro, I need to point out that because I'm not a custom figure artisan, I'm not going to be breaking out sculpting putty and paint to revamp figures into new costumes and characters. Therefore, I begrudgingly settle for the current Vision, Wanda, and Barton figures. However, with the MCU Natasha, only two notable versions are absent from the lineup: her debut look from Iron Man 2 and her appearance in Civil War. Certainly a number of her plainclothes looks are also missing from the Legends catalog, but as far as her overall film representations, only Iron Man 2 and Civil War are absent. This means there are a lot of ScarJo Black Widow options in the Legends line to kit bash from to dial in whatever version of the character you're needing, unlike the aforementioned Vision, Scarlet Witch, and Hawkeye, where unless you're a sculptor and a painter, you won't be able to get close to the desired results, since so few pre-Endgame versions of those characters are in the Legends line. However, even with Black Widow, I thought I was about to dodge the bullet entirely, as most collectors had been clamoring for updated versions of Cap and Natasha from the Winter Soldier for the Legends range. The figures from the Winter Soldier were some of the earliest Marvel Legends figures from Hasbro, so the features and face sculpts left a lot to be desired. Hasbro was still trying to find its way back then. Naturally, I thought with the latest face accuracy tech for their movie-based figures, the announced updated versions of Winter Soldier Steve Rogers and Natasha Romanoff would be turnkey solutions for not only my Winter Soldier Captain America, but also for my Winter Soldier and Age of Ultron Black Widows. See, the original Winter Soldier Black Widow figure came with two different heads, one for the Avengers and one for the Winter Soldier. This new updated Black Widow was no different in that regard. How does this apply to the Age of Ultron? Well, the only way in the United States to get a truly accurate Age of Ultron Black Widow at the time of its release in theaters was a huge Amazon exclusive multi-pack that included Thor, Bruce Banner, Hawkeye, and Black Widow. The figure included was a repaint of the Winter Soldier original, and included the Avengers head, also repainted slightly. Also, unlike the original Winter Soldier figure that came with pistols molded into their holsters and no other displayable weapons, this Ultron variant, while still suffering the glued-in Glocks, did come with her shock batons from the end battle in Sokovia, but she was still sporting that earlier Hasbro face sculpt. So by getting the updated Infinity Saga Black Widow, I'd have ostensibly the most accurate faces for my Winter Soldier Natasha right out of the box, as well as the shorter-haired head for my Age of Ultron figure. What could go wrong? Well, pretty much everything when the highly anticipated update for ScarJo ended up not only looking arguably worse than the original Legends figure, but looking nothing like Johansson at all. I would describe this figure as Christina Applegate if she was a very bored vampire. I was baffled by this turn of events, mainly because the MCU Black Widow figures had been getting steadily more impressive in terms of the face sculpts since the huge leap with the Infinity War version. This was the version I used as the basis for my original head swap for my Winter Soldier and Age of Ultron kit bashes. The situation was made worse by the fact that 3/4 of the figure was the original Winter Soldier Natasha body. This isn't necessarily a crime in itself, as despite my feelings back when I made my previous video, I've softened on the original sculpt as being a better option than the body underneath the Infinity War version's vest. However, this latest version chose to replace the upper torso and arms with a new assembly that, while including double-jointed elbows, also has a sculpt very soft in costume details and appears to be taking cues from the Salma Hayek Eternals figure in the downplay the bust line department. On the Infinity War figure, this was necessary to get the green combat vest to look correct on the figure. But without the vest, the upper torso of the figure looks strange. Hasbro appears to have attempted a middle ground between this torso and the original on this Infinity Saga figure. More unforgivable with the reuse of the original figure is the reuse of the glued-in pistols. This is straight up laziness on Hasbro's part, especially when you consider that every Black Widow since the Ultron variant came with working holsters, even if the figure didn't come with pistols at all. This is twice as frustrating when you see the pair of loose pistols included with the figure that are made to look like some vaguely sci-fi Nerf blasters she never carried. They are so oddly shaped, the new Black Widow's hands cannot properly hold them, making the whole exercise of this long-wanted update a total washout. Why did Hasbro make the misguided decision to go back to the well with this figure's design for its final release? And why did they botch the face update when they'd all but perfected that aspect of MCU Natasha in the preceding figures in the Marvel Legends line? They had so many different Natasha bodies in the range to choose from, and so many superior face updates on the books that were far more successful. I have to believe a superior kit bash was possible if they needed to save some cash. But the only way to be certain was to get in front of the MCU Natashas that had been released between the Infinity War version and this last one. And those were the ones I'd never collected. The idea that they had to reuse an 8-year-old lower body that hasn't been seen since 2015 and then spent their budget on this figure for a retooled pair of arms and a faceplant of a face print would be hilarious if it wasn't so avoidable. As it is, it's just mind-blowingly inept. With all of that established, how did the MCU Black Widows from Hasbro after the excellent Infinity War version actually fare? First, let's point out a few things about the Infinity War version. The face was about as bang-on as one could ask for from a mass-produced retail action figure. A massive leap forward from the Winter Soldier Age of Ultron version, the paintwork on this really captured that slight mischievous smirk Johansson's Natasha Romanoff often exhibited in those early MCU installments.
Was that your first kiss since 1945?
However, with this figure also came an entirely new figure underneath, with legs that looked more correct to MCU Black Widow than the previous versions, which skewed more toward Batman Returns Catwoman. But let me reiterate, that original body overall wasn't a disaster by any means. The Infinity War body's lower half simply had a noticeable improvement. Where the new body went weird was the upper half, which, as I've explained, was designed to accommodate the combat vest while keeping the figure looking proportionate. This Black Widow also began the annoying trend of packing the character with useless accessories, those being the pair of stun guns, 2 pieces of nothing black plastic that are just meant to sit in the holsters. I find it ironic that the pistols were molded into the holsters despite being what would have been usable accessories, while these tiny plastic rectangles that aren't at all usable in her hands would have been better off molded into the holsters. In addition, she comes with her Infinity War electroshock wiffle bats. I'm not a big fan of these weapons. I think they look stupid. I much prefer the smaller, more ninja-like batons from Age of Ultron. But hey, these are accurate to the film, so we go with what we're given, I guess. Despite the sculpting compromises to the upper body of this figure to work with the combat vest, the base figure for this Infinity War variant will come up again shortly. Next, Hasbro released the Quantum Suit variant of Natasha from Endgame in a 2-pack with Hawkeye. I hated this whole range of figures and I didn't want any of them, but I wanted to make sure I had the head from this figure to show in this video. And fortunately, because this head was popular with kit bashers, I was able to find this head from a seller who'd popped it onto the body of the movie Black Widow from the Crimson Dynamo Build-A-Figure wave. And truthfully, it's a really good likeness of Johansson. It doesn't have the smirk as much in the Paint app, she's more somber, but it's endgame, so she would be a little more maudlin. That isn't a gripe, just an observation. The head looks really nice. Too bad the quantum suit bodies were all junk. Plus, she came with those wiffle bats again. Who needs those anyway? Hasbro would take this head and the core body from the Infinity War figure, sans vest, and put them together for a special endgame version of Natasha that was sold exclusively in the UK as part of an armored Thanos Build-A-Figure wave. Hasbro was trying to approximate Natasha's final costume prior to her death, but do it on the cheap, so nothing was really done to modify this costume from the Infinity War body. She also came with those wiffle bats and blasted stun guns again, even though in the actual scene, she's carrying her dual pistols. Despite the low-rent kit bash, the dumb accessories, and the slight oddity of the upper torso, she's actually one of the best-looking MCU Natashas to come out of Hasbro, and while it's a shame it was limited to the UK, it's not difficult to kit bash your own together with a Quantum Suit ScarJo head and the Infinity War ScarJo base body. Hell, if you can get the pistols and the smaller batons from the Crimson Dynamo figure, you're really in business with this version of the character. And that's probably a good segue into discussing the figures from the deservedly maligned Black Widow movie from 2021. The best thing I can say about a terrible superhero movie is that sometimes, as in this case, it produces really nice quality action figures that end up going for fire sale prices. Hasbro pulled out all the stops for the Black Widow line, and thanks to a global pandemic, the figures showed up almost a year before the movie did, where they sat for the most part before being closed out. The movie was a mess, but the figures ended up being quite nice, all things considered. First up was the previously mentioned Black Widow in her end movie outfit, finally coming packed with her pistols and the Age of Ultron style batons. If you're wondering why her hairstyle looks so different from how she had it in the film in this outfit, I guess we have to chalk that up to early marketing materials that depicted Johansson with this costume and the hairstyle that Hasbro clearly used as a reference. It's also possible, because we know the final act of the film was heavily rewritten and reshot during production, that Johansson's hairstyle might at one time have been like the action figures and then changed. Whatever the reason, the face sculpt is still one of the better ones for the character, despite being a bit softer in the details than the Infinity War and Endgame faces. Finally, there was the deluxe movie Black Widow in the white costume that came packed with everything we wish Hasbro would have provided a Spider-Man at some point by now. Complete with her dual pistols, those brutal Kusari Gamma-looking things, tons of blast effects and wrist shock effects, and if that wasn't enough, an entire adjustable display flight stand for her. Hasbro clearly wanted to send Johansson off in style, even if Disney screwed up her final outing. And thankfully, the figure's face looked really decent, aside from a tendency for this version of the character to often have eyes looking upward for some strange reason. While this figure was literally the Crimson Dynamo version painted white with a different gun belt, the face details came out sharper than the other, closer to the Infinity War and Endgame versions than the end movie face. And that brings us up to the present, to this thing. The version so demanded by fans for an update, they wanted it more than an Iron Man 2 or Civil War version, both unmade to date. And the real kick in the teeth is this version is so inexplicably backward in its engineering, you can't easily kit bash over better heads without dealing with the same compromises already faced prior to this version's release. Hasbro has a terrible habit of changing the sizes and configurations of the neck posts on their Marvel and Star Wars 6-inch figures from character to character and version to version. With Black Widow, they've done something so frustrating, you'd swear it was deliberate just to mess with customers so they can't fix the issue. The original head for both the Winter Soldier and its Age of Ultron variant had a neck hole that was positioned near the center of the head itself. With the figure bodies at the time having solid ball joint neck posts, this robust if somewhat limiting design ensured the head swapping would be a durable affair. However, with the changeover to the Infinity War head, Hasbro's designers moved the neck hole almost all the way to the back of the head and changed the neck post to a pivot hinge. At the time I was discovering this, when I took the Infinity War head and swapped it into the Winter Soldier hairstyle, I assumed the change must have been necessary to ensure her chin would balance with the collar of the combat vest piece rather than being too far back. This led to the compromise of this head looking too far forward on the original bodies when viewed on profile. A small annoyance, since most of the time she would be displayed in the Age of Ultron group with no real good look at her profile. But I'd hoped the Infinity Saga version would solve all those issues in a turnkey fashion. The placement of the neck hole for the Infinity War head carried over into the Endgame head and the Black Widow movie heads. So the best looking heads to choose from wouldn't work perfectly with the Winter Soldier or Age of Ultron bodies. And the body underneath the Infinity War Black Widow had compromises of its own, such as lacking shield insignia and that narrow upper torso. However, the designers at Hasbro have opted to return to the original neck hole placement for the Infinity Saga Black Widow, which you might think would make sense given they recycled most of the original figure itself. But remember, they remade the entire upper torso and arms, which includes a newly designed neck post that is totally different from the original, as well as all of those succeeding figures with the nicer face sculpts and pivot hinge necks. So the preceding ScarJo heads from Infinity War to the Black Widow movie figures are not going to look right on the Saga body because of the protruding chin, and the depth of the hole makes these heads on the original and Saga bodies look like Natasha has no neck. It completely blows my mind how Hasbro ate its own tail on the progression of this character through their figure development timeline. The Infinity Saga updated Johansson Natasha that was at the top of many MCU want lists has turned out to be the worst since the original figures. Hasbro, despite multiple generations of better face sculpt and paint apps, working leg holsters, and a number of the figures packed with realistic dual pistols, went back to the molded-in pistols, the original spindlier legs, and the original head attachment design that results in the new body not being compatible with the majority of Black Widow heads in the range. Despite all my efforts, I return to the imperfect compromise of the Infinity War head with Avengers hair on the Age of Ultron body, now knowing that the best looking figures in the range were a blonde with a green vest, a kit bash, and a repaint. What kind of company reverses course on 8 years of progress with one of the most anticipated figure releases of the year and dusts off obsolete parts from the figure everyone was so dissatisfied with it caused the demand for a remake in the first place? That would be Hasbro, the same company that fired the whole staff off of its most profitable product line last year and sold an entire movie studio for pennies while prioritizing fat bonuses to all of its executives, even as the business watched its stock prices plunge. Hasbro is quite the marvel, and hardly a legend.